welcome everybody. When we went round and we asked people and we asked colleagues about what they wanted from this one of the key areas of feedback from the faculties was it'd be really helpful to have something around group work projects for delivering on and off campus. So this is what I've actually kind of like put together. Now, I had planned on more people coming, so there's a Mentimeter sitting in the background. So what we might actually be able to do is just discuss this instead of actually relying on the additional tech. So what I thought we'd do is possibly have a discussion around, first of all, create a bench line around what do we look for in effective group work? And then what are the challenges with actually translating that online into a distance kind of like learning context? And within that space, what kind of technologies are available to help develop that kind of relationship online and to support the literature talks a lot about communication with students, but also the idea of how to take that to the next level and enhance more effective forms of collaboration. And then what I've put in at the end is some examples of some things that I've done in the past, which weren't necessarily rocket science, but they did work remarkably well in terms of facilitating group work. So it wasn't done online. This was a face, but actually it does transpose very easily to an online kind of like format. So we'll go through that, but I think given the size of the group today, we can have a bit of a chat around that as well. So my first question, I sat down and thought about, right, how do we handle this? So what I'd like you to do to start with, and again, we don't have to do this on Mentimeter. I think we could just discuss this amongst ourselves. So put yourself in the position of a student in lockdown, working remotely and being asked to contribute online to project work. What three words do you think might best describe their perspective and perhaps state of mind or their perception of that instruction? Would anybody like to have a go? Because there's not enough here that's going to generate a big word cloud. So let's go around. Alana, if you were a student at home, how would you be feeling with that kind of instruction?
I mean, I probably just knowing myself, even as an adult, I'd probably be a little bit nervous. I'd definitely feel nervous or anxious. That's just me. That's the first word that would pop into my head. I suppose it would depend on the project work. I'd probably feel a bit maybe apprehensive about how I'd had to deliver it. So if I was asked to use a certain bit of technology, I'd probably be apprehensive with that work and what would happen if it didn't work. Is it going to crash on me?
Okay, that's great. Harold, can we come to you? So you're next on my list.
Yeah, I can identify with a lot of that. And I think I see a lot of what I would say default apprehension, people feeling disconnected, things like trying to get them to put a camera on. They really don't want to. Put them in a group and they'll sit there and be silent together. I think it's making that first step. It's getting that first step of actually being part of it is I think what I see a lot of. That's
great, thank you. Kayam.
Yeah, I guess it would probably depend really. It's about knowing people, which is quite scary. But if the course is designed with engagement and interaction, then kind of opportunities to know people in the first instance before you actually do group work, I think that's what helps facilitates and brings down a bit of these nerves and things like that.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Siobhan?
So I think I'm thinking back actually to when I was a student, and I was a very quiet student. So actually I'd probably be quite happy that I don't have to sort of interact and speak up so much in it. Although probably some of the tech side of it might, if I wasn't familiar, might seem a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. Stuart? And Stuart, while you're talking, I just want to go and grab my iPad because I'm going to tweak. So I can leave you for a minute.
I'll waffle until you come back. I think I was thinking similar things to everybody else, but one thing I was thinking of in the previous session with Ali is this. So there's a question of etiquette, which I don't think we maybe spend enough time thinking about in terms of engagement, because that was not a huge room, but about 25 people, and he was asking the open room for contributions. And first thing in the morning, I was not necessarily leaping, although a few things were entering my mind. And then by the time I thought I'd do it, somebody else had jumped in. And I think it's tricky because I always... I'm getting away from your question, Andy. You're back. I don't need to waffle as much, but there's inconsistency in how people present these kinds of discussions. And sometimes it's very structured. You like raise your hand in the software and to participate. Other times it's just an open free for all. I'm not saying any of these are better or worse than others, but I think sometimes if you're not clear what the etiquette is, it can be hard to put yourself out there.
Thanks for that, Stu. Zara.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I mean, coming at the end of all of that, I don't think I've got, much else particularly insightful to add. I mean, I'm actually on maternity leave at the moment, so I'm here because I really want to understand what the experiences have been for people engaging with students a lot more online just now. And I just can really imagine actually that if it were me, the kind of stress of a different situation and just kind of being watched in a different way, because I think there's a lot of students of mine anyway who will happily sit to the back of a room and try and kind of blend into the background, not be noticed. But obviously, I mean, just looking at how this works here, I mean, everybody can see your face, everybody can really stare at you while you're talking and things. And I know that I have students that come to me before a seminar and say, please don't ask me anything, please don't ask me to speak. And I imagine it's quite a lot more difficult to get away with if you've got, people sitting on camera all the time. But then, one of you was just saying that it's difficult to get people to turn their cameras on. So maybe that's not so much of an issue as I imagine. I'm not sure.
That's great. And it's the reason I asked that question is I went to a session, a webinar over the summer, and it was an advanced HE one. And somebody just said something that everybody in the group kind of like just stopped. And it was very simply this question, and I wrote it down on a post-it note. It says, if you consider yourself and how mentally you have been through lockdown, how have you felt? And it came out, do you feel, are you comfortable? Do you feel isolated? Do you feel lonely? Are you actually confident with what you're being asked to do? Are you familiar with the different concepts? Are you familiar with the technology? So there's a lot of issues, I think, around preparing for group work. And then it's that devolved group work responsibility of, well, when I'm working in a group face-to-face, I can actually tell other people to get some work done. How do I perhaps control or deal with people that are riding project work online? So it's the internal group dynamics, I think, which comes out. But I think the important point I was trying to get with this first exercise was think, actually, we perhaps need to think within that kind of like group work domain, how you facilitate the relational component and actually make students feel confident about what they're doing. So, right. I thought it might be useful. And I've just gone and got a bit of tech. This is the this is what we do. This is the flexibility of online learning. All right. So I've just gone and got my iPad. So instead of doing this on Mentimeter, I'm going to try and connect my iPad in a tick. But what I like to do is can we create a baseline? So if we're thinking about what is effective online group work, I think the starting point perhaps needs to be, okay, what are the effective ingredients for group work per se? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a think about that. And while you do that, I'm going to try and be a little bit clever. So just bear with me. Please work. Please work. Right, let's just hope I've got some charge in that. Right. Hopefully you can all see my iPad screen. Yes! Hooray, we do know what we're doing here. Right, okay. Let's just go round and everybody can chip in, or you can drop this into the chat. what for you makes effective group work? And I'll scribble them, and then I'll save these slides and distribute them around later on. Kayam.
Roles and responsibilities.
It's all right, I can't spell today. Lovely.
I think shared enthusiasm.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Clear goals, both immediate and long term.
Go away, sorry. Yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, I suppose there's the obvious thing that you need to, I mean, in normal circumstances, you need to be able to meet in, you know, a reasonable place, get together and to, or have the technology to do this properly and the knowledge of it.
Okay. Harold, what about yourself, sir?
I don't think I've got anything to add. I was certainly going to have, you know, a very clear task, perhaps, you know, a doing task rather than one that's presented as a discussing task. So I think Stuart covers me with clear goals and so on.
Is there anything your industry head would say, Harold, from the industry side of things?
Yeah, sure. Consequences.
Of
sort of rewards for success and consequences for failure. Absolutely. You know.
So I like the consequences for failure, and that's good. Definitely got to go in.
Yeah.
Can I ask you all a question? Because we've all been at university, we've all been through the system. To perhaps encourage some reflection on this. What was the most enjoyable bit of group work that you all undertook, and why? Was there a particular driver behind it that really made you engage and actually get something from it?
I think I might add, because I've had sort of two different experiences, because I did an undergraduate in history, but then I went on to do dance and drama. So I didn't particularly like the sort of more seminars sitting around discussing, talking about stuff, but I really liked much more the sort of, you know, action, sort of participatory learning, sort of much more sort of the doing something with people and communicating in the process of doing, rather than something that just focus on the discussion element.
I hope I'm just capturing all this accurately. Right, that's lovely. Stu, what about yourself? So I'm going to let Catherine, Catherine's coming in, so we'll jump on Catherine as she comes in.
I'm struggling to remember any group work I did at university, actually. Maybe I was just taught poorly. Though I was thinking, there's something, it's not quite, but sort of metacognitive about this, is I think like it's an awareness of group dynamics. I think that good group work requires people to be aware of what good group work involves, if that makes sense, that there will be challenges, there will be personality clashes, there will be people who pull their weight more than others. I think I fudged an answer out of nothing there.
No, good recovery, Stu. That's a great answer. Thank you. Shared awareness of group dynamic, how it works. So for me, that also raises the, if I may just add one in, I would possibly put in here the induction to group work. So that raises the issue of, I think sometimes, at what level are you doing this in terms of kind of like the overall group work literacy those students have actually developed and their confidence to engage. So the type of group work that you might do with a level 4 student might be quite different to the kind of like group work activity you do at level 6, because the students have gained more confidence. It's heard this before. It's like the playground analogy. Group work with level 4, it's like kids and parents in a park. Where are they? They're quite close to you. Where are they at level 5? They've moved a bit further afield because you're letting them play and you're letting them experiment. Where are they at level 6? They've gone. They don't want to be with you. They're doing it all by themselves. The challenge, of course, is when you're doing it face-to-face and you're working with students in group, you have that consistent touching point with them all the time, where if they're in a session with you, they can feed back, you can ask how it's going. So you have that connectivity often around group work, which I used to really like with the students. They'd come up and really give you a bit of, oh, this is going on this week. What we'll do in a minute is the challenges of translating that online. Catherine Murgatroyd. Hello.
Hello, Andy.
I'm gonna get you now because you came in late. Catherine, what's the best bit of group work that you've enjoyed and why?
Well, that is an on-the-spot question. The best bit of group work that I enjoyed was a project that students designed themselves, where we basically ran a poster campaign. The students wanted to run a poster campaign on campus, and they got into small groups. And the idea of the posters was to raise awareness of marginalised identities, and students, just the passion that they had and the posters that they produced was so impressive. All the staff came away feeling very de-skilled, because we were saying, gosh, if we were tasked to produce these posters, they certainly wouldn't be as good as these. Yeah, I would say that's been probably my most enjoyable piece of group work. And it was an on-campus piece of group work, so students kind of found themselves rooms on campus, and myself and my colleague would go around and visit the rooms. But the buzz from the rooms was just great.
Thank you for that. Okay, that's really good. Is there anything on the screen? Again, I was going to do this on Catherine. The plan was I was going to do this on Mentimeter. The group size has dropped, so we're doing it. We're being flexible today and kind of like leading by example. Is there anything I've missed? Is there anything else that you'd put on there that if you were standing up, is there anything else we'd say to the students? This is critical.
Can I come in, Andy?
Manish, hello, hiya.
Good morning. Yeah, I think it's very important for if you've got a group task which kind of follows with the actual learning together. If people have been learning together, they get a chance to know each other's skill sets, knowledge base first of all, and then also the softer skills if they are sort of working together to some kind of shared goal, which is kind of mentioned. That the goals are mentioned, but unless they are shared amongst the whole team, it's not going to really come together. And also, so it's related to content knowledge. It's if somebody is not feeling confident, they're not going to speak up in a group, and whatever size it is. So confidence is important, and trust is big thing, between people, which develops only in an unorchestrated environment. Develops like over 8 weeks. In my PhD, I studied machine orchestration. So we orchestrated small groups through interactions prompted by machine, and that made it quite speedy. But lecturers, as lecturers, we can't orchestrate every single group in the class. It becomes very difficult. It takes normally about 8 weeks for teams to come together. So time, because of the trust factor.
Manish, thank you for that. Okay, is everybody happy with that? So what we've tried to do is kind of like saying, in an ideal world, here are the kind of like, this is the baseline for what we'd like to try and do with kind of like group work. So almost the pre-COVID, this is what we're actually trying to do. So the next question, I won't go to PowerPoint because I can just tell you what it is if this is our baseline, what is the challenge now of transitioning this thinking online? Where are we running in to potential barriers? So if I put challenges online, like that. So there's our baseline. What are our immediate challenges, do you think, of actually trying to do that online that people are struggling with across the university at the moment? And perhaps think back to that first question about how students are actually feeling in this kind of space as well.
I think disconnection.
Within that kind of space, so like disconnection between.
I just think it's just the, you know, just not having that sort of face to face. That, you know, even though we're having this session now and we can see each other's faces, there's just still this disconnection. For me, anyway, it's just not my, you know, and I'm sure other students feel the same. It's just not my, you know, my favourite way of communicating.
I totally agree with that. I think that when you meet people in a group face to face, you do the work and you have the conversations you're meant to have, but you also have the little kind of 2 or 3 minutes here and there where you chat about normal stuff, you know, and you get to know each other a little bit. And all of the experience that I've had doing anything online, whether it's meetings with colleagues or anything else, that doesn't happen in the same way. So I don't think you get the kind of humanity of it.
Yeah, the body language is lost, and the tone of voice. It's all of those kind of like those human contact elements that are lost. Yeah.
But even is it also the? I can remember when I was based at Chai, in our library, we had pods, and you'd go in for a coffee in the Costa, and you'd see them in at certain times of the year when I'd sent my students group work, and you know it was my module because they would all be in the library doing it, and they'd be in the pods, and they'd they'd book these pods out all day, and they'd live there, and they would have their lunch together, and they would live together as like a little support bubble. But you'd walk in, and they'd be there, and you know they'd be there, so you could just quickly put your head around the corner and go, "Still here, guys? How you doing?" And it was that. It sounds so simple now, doesn't it? And so what's the word I'm looking for? At the time when you do it, so inconsequential, but when you don't have it, you begin to realize how important those small interjections are with students that you don't, you know, it's a minute, perhaps 2 minutes of hi, how you getting on, which you don't have on the lack of, you know, when I have group work meetings, you know, one thing my waistline's doing better for it, but cake and bringing biscuits if you've got a group meeting, or that person in the group that's I brought something along to share with everybody. So it really is that lack of humanity and socialization, which I think is really challenging. And that goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. Anything else?
I'd sort of add to that about environment as well, because I think, like you were saying about, you know, if you could go meet people and escape maybe your home environment, whereas at the moment, obviously, students' environments might not be the best place sort of to be having, you know, those discussions and what have you. That those group work discussions. So if they're at home and it's not the best environment, then that's going to have an impact. Yeah.
Thank you, Alana. Anybody else like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to environment, also in relation to specific environments where different activities happen. So obviously there's no access to drama spaces if you're doing, you know, any of the performing arts, or sort of, you know, architectural, you know, spaces, just thinking about the areas that I'm sort of looking at. And any activities that we do which sort of also look at public engagement. So we're having to rethink those sorts of things because there's no way to engage in specific spaces or the public. So that sort of, again, just relates to the impact that environments can have. Although, you know, I have seen some great examples of where people have sort of, you know, create a performance in your bedroom and people have really transformed their spaces. So it might be a way of working with it to get students thinking about how they can transform the spaces that they are in that can support the learning project they're doing.
Lovely. That's I'm just going to scribble that down. Sorry. And please continue. Anybody else like to chip in while I take notes?
I just add to that actually that I think depending on what your subject is, you know, you're going to have more or less problems with this. I mean, I teach on gender, and part of that is teaching, you know, on gender-based violence and gender rights and things. And, you know, you really do need to feel like you're in quite a safe environment to discuss things like that. I mean, I'm not asking, obviously, people to discuss their personal experiences, but even to discuss opinions and ideas, you know, can be tricky if you're in a situation where people can hear you talking about things that you know that they're not going to be on board with, if you like.
Lovely, thank you for that. Colleagues, any more? Stuart. So I know where they're reliable, but I know where people are.
It's getting picked on a lot today. That's fine.
Don't worry.
I think there's something about I can't quite articulate in the right way, but it's around how we scaffold these things. And I don't think it's a challenge that's unique to online learning. I think there's a lot of evidence for many years now about first generation students going into university. They don't know what the rules of engagement are. And I say this from personal experience. I was a first generation student going to university. I didn't know what it was like when I got there. And so there's this whole set of implicit rules that were always there about how universities work. Why do we lecture? Why does the library exist? That we maybe don't spend enough time talking about with students. And then COVID has sort of stuck a whole layer on top of that about why are these online classrooms like this? Why are we continuing to do group work? Why is it set up in a space that we're in charge of as staff? Or if it's not, why is it student-led? I think that. But when you're in such a condensed environment where you don't have as much time, it's those little conversations you were talking about earlier, Andy. That's often where those kinds of things happen because they're more informal. It's hard and it's sometimes counterproductive. Just right, I'm going to spend 10 minutes at the start of this lecture just talking about the learning we'll do, and then we'll actually get to the bit you're interested in. No solutions there, but maybe a bit of a whinge.
That's great, Stu. Thank you. Anybody? Any else? I'm just conscious of time, but a couple more points from anybody. Anything that they perhaps experienced during TB1 that might be pertinent here, or feedback from students?
I think perhaps it's related a little to what Stuart said, that when I do any analysis, for example, I go in and look at Moodle participation. Generally speaking, participation is quite good. But it's only half the cohort. I have that feeling that half the damn cohort are out there and we're missing them, or I'm missing them entirely, or they're missing the module entirely. And I've got no idea why. And it's very difficult off campus to even understand why. So I think there's almost that prior step to anything we're trying to run. Well, then how do we even get them sort of in the door, so to speak, which perhaps is what Stuart's saying, that, you know, they've arrived on campus and this is so alien to all of them. And it's almost like, well, they're not even playing for whatever reasons of their own. They're not even playing.
Okay. Last one more from somebody. That'd be great.
Let's pick up on what Harold's saying, but on a slightly different tangent. And again, I'm somewhat thinking as I go, but there is somewhat of a challenge to assume homogeneity of the student body as well. I think that we're all saying there's going to be issues with mental health, which is probably true for lots of people, or whatever issues that we've raised today. But actually, I was talking with a group of students, when was this, like November, and they were all peer mentors, very keen, engaged students, and they were quite annoyed because they were thinking, well, this is a great opportunity to spend more time being engaged in your learning, and they were very enthusiastically engaged and were quite annoyed that a lot of their peers weren't, but aware of the same kinds of issues we are. So there's something around being aware of the heterogeneity of the student body, but also that students are also aware of these things, and we probably need to talk to them sensitively, of course, and that can be a challenge in and of itself.
Okay, right, on that note, Stu, thank you. Right, so if I just quickly, that's what we said was kind of like what we're looking for. And then we're starting to think about the potential barriers to how we actually achieve that. So I'm going to just try and get back to my PowerPoint, hopefully. There we go. Right, so I can ignore that one. I can ignore that one. Right. So let me perhaps finish. We've got about half an hour, 25 minutes. Let me just perhaps finish with how do we then tackle that? So the first way I think sometimes to doing this is to actually almost start with what we're doing now. And you think actually a framework for an online group work is to perhaps think about what you do before, what you do after, what you do before, what you do during, and what you do after. So if I may, so if we think about before, this starts, it's just the planning. I think a lot of this is the pre-planning. And I think if you look at the sessions that Ali's done for us at the different conferences, and he talks about blended learning, and Stuart talks about scaffolded learning, which is an integral part of that. You know, Ali talks a lot about active blended learning being underpinned by kind of like team-based approaches and the importance of design at the beginning to avoid design failure later on. So in terms of online group work, what I've just done here is just thought to myself, right, what would I be asking myself before I start? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but in terms of the kind of projects that you're actually asking the students to do, can they do it remotely? Is it feasible? Are the challenges too much? Do we need to make a slight adjustment? Or actually, it would work really well, but I just need to think about potentially what I'm asking them to produce, how I guide them, and how they're going to operate in that space. And how do I actually move from a point of the students are cooperating together, but actually what I'd really like them to be able to do is collaborate. So what kind of support do I do for that? And in that regard, kind of like what kind of technology would fit best for that collaboration. And what I tried to do here is kind of like link with the focus on the assessment first, to make sure that whatever we do has that pedagogic bent from the beginning, not just going in with a sledgehammer and saying, I'm just going to put it all on a Moodle forum and we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Because it might not be the best mechanism or the environment for students to engage with. And so it's just, at the beginning, it's just auditing, for me, the kind of questions that actually might come up. And the bigger one for me, and this is the one that's niggled at me for years with students when I do a lot of group work, is how do I ensure fairness and accountability within the group, particularly where they're online. And if, you know what it's like, if you've got a group of students that are beginning to malfunction and they're all sitting around the table, you can sit down with them for 5 minutes and say, guys, I think there's an issue emerging here. What's going on? And you can almost nip it in the bud. When you're remote, I'm not sure you can have that same interplay. So it's what kind of mechanisms can you put in place that gives the students the opportunity to monitor their own health, if you like, and if something's going wrong, perhaps press a little alert button that draws you in quite quickly into that process. You can also then think about, well, what are you going to be kind of like doing after, during as well? So this is how I'm monitoring, how if I know they're on task. And I think that comes back to perhaps Stu's comment about scaffolding and actually building up lots of little mini tasks in a project that you can track to make sure they're actually on they're on station and working towards the overall assessment endpoint. The other interesting one for me around this engagement is how are you actually involving the students in the group evaluation process itself? And to what extent have you embedded some element of peer review in that process, so they're monitoring each other's engagement as that process continues? And I've got an example of that at the end, and that kind of like links to kind of like what mechanisms have you got in place if kind of like any issues arrive. And within that, what's my role? Well, how can I best provide feedback and support? And how can I perhaps do that through formative assessment? So these are just very much indicative questions, and you probably have your own in regard to the kind of like group project work that you're doing. And then after, again, have the students met their learning outcomes, but also I think this kind of like came out of Ali's point this morning, and I think it's emerging now, is how do I get students to reflect on their group work skills? How do I get them to kind of like reflect on the group dynamics and their contribution in that group? But also, this online group work for me is becoming an emergent graduate skill. So it's actually encouraging them to reflect on what they've actually done online and make sure that is suitably recorded on their CV somewhere, or they recognize the significance of it. So when they do go to a job interview, they can talk quite fluently about the experiences and the skills and the competences they've actually gained, not just by doing group work online. Okay, please chip in at any point if anybody'd like to add anything. So from that one, what we then arrive at is this is what's called the 5 C's model from Naranci and a few others, but it just identifies 5 kind of like areas of that for me are really nice, easy to follow. So 5 C's. So first of all, connect. How are you going to create a platform where you can actually discuss anything? So student to student, but also student to staff. But within that, then developing that platform for communication and how you actually track that kind of like communication ongoing, getting the students involved in that. Your role in the online group process as a curator in terms of how you present resources, how you present information, again, particularly before, I think, and actually inducting students into the kind of group work that you actually want to do online, the expectation, the timeframes that they need to be working towards. But within that also creating the spaces for collaboration and actually working together and bouncing ideas off. And we talked about one of the key facets of group work being the identification of key roles and responses in a group and how that might underpin collaboration going forward. And then create the creation element. What is it you're actually asking them to produce at the end and how you're going to support that? And perhaps does that need to change now that we've put everything online? Now, what we can then do, if you start, I'm still trying to do the pedagogic approach to start with, but then this leads us to, okay, if we then try and think about under each areas that we're working towards, here are the kind of technologies that are available that we can provide resources from in the creator role, but also that the resources the students themselves can actually use to facilitate communication and be that level of collaboration. And I'm not going to go into all of these because if you look back over the Learning and Teaching Festival and the Mini Fest, there's lots of examples where we've actually discussed these kind of like technologies and how they could be used. The H5P ones. The most recent Padlet workshop I did was about using Padlet as a vehicle for a slightly more advanced way of actually facilitating group work and actually putting students in group for projects. And again, that's from the last mini fest. So the point is establish the pedagogy, think about the role that you have, and then think about the technologies that might best to align in terms of what you actually want them to do. Now, what I would also say is, if you could add an additional C onto this 5, because I think there are perhaps a few more, what would you add? Are there any additional? Let's do that. That's what I would. That's the most. I think that's the one for me that's mostly missing, because the most important one for me is I would be having co-creation through those conversations with the students at the very beginning about, right, how do you want this group to work? What is your expectation? You set the narrative of how it's going to run. You set if you're going to do peer assessment, you develop the criteria on which you're going to judge yourself as a group. So I think co-creation is an important one that fits in there. Are there any others? Any other C's?
I mean, thinking along the lines of skills, I'm thinking caliber as a C, but I mean, to know who's fit for what job, and without that, it's pretty hard. Yeah, and aligning that up. Right, the competencies, isn't it? It's developing that, yes. The competencies around that, about who's going to do what. I would also potentially put in there, be creative in terms of the kind of assessment that you want to put online. I would worry that we're seeing that we can't be creative online in the types of projects that students could be doing. It may be that the endpoint assessment in terms of what they're producing could be tweaked to create something that is just as engaging, if not possibly more engaging or creative than things that they've actually been doing in the past. So again, it's just this again, it's the interpretation of this kind of framework to guide your approach. But let me finish by just giving you some examples of the kind of things I've done that have worked. I think that, so first one here is, this is just within the module handbooks, and you can do this on Moodle, is making sure the students have a really defined timetable and checkpoints for particular actions that they need to complete. So I've just taken this screenshot from a
module handbook. I used to run a God, I can't remember, data analysis module, and we used to get the students to do a live research project over 12 weeks. And at the end of 12 weeks, you know, they'd have to design a survey on JISC online, they'd have to analyze it, and then they'd have to work to produce a live poster. And we marked it collectively at the end. So what I did over 12 weeks is I gave them very clear dates by which, if I was doing this, this is the date by which I would probably have this done by. So they knew that they were on track. Now, of course, I'd build a little bit of leeway into that. But the idea was, if you can meet these dates, then you're pretty much going to hit the endpoint target, and you're going to have a little bit of time spare to go and rehearse and to polish what you want. Okay. The aim here was to try and avoid that. This will stop you doing it the night before. Did it work? I'll come back to that one. The other thing I also used to do with the students, and again, I've found an example, is I actually used to get them to create a charter for their groups. And I've just found this example, but I used to do something very similar where we actually used to sit down with the students and say, right, guys, at a group level, I want you to take responsibility for it. So I'd like you to, first of all, they always had to come up with a team name, a bit like The Apprentice. And I always used to get them to kind of like craft like a vision strategy for what they actually wanted to do. But within that, to create their own rules for how they were actually going to engage together as a group. And they used to type it up, and it would go in a logbook that I actually created for them. And it'd be at the beginning. So everybody was working to the same kind of narrative in terms of, as a group, this is what we're actually committing ourselves to. So it gave them that sense of ownership pretty early on, in terms of they were dictating the nature of the kind of like own destiny, if you like, in terms of the kind of group work that they were doing. And this was the other thing I did, is I gave them a logbook. Now, face to face, you know, I'd actually print this off so I could actually take it in. But this would be so easy to replicate online in a Google Docs. And all I asked them to do was very simply, every time they met, they had to have an agenda, they had to take minutes, and they also had to complete a log of actions identified, actions undertaken, by whom, by when, and to what extent that process was completed. So basically, in my head, it served as a way of actually developing some accountability within the group to make sure that everybody was pulling their weight and actively involved in the process. And then what we also did on top of that, and again, this is just a screenshot of the kind of like mechanism that we used, was we got the students to peer assess. Every time they had a meeting, they would peer assess themselves. And it wasn't, this evolved. So originally we were doing peer assessment at the end of the module, sorry, at the middle of the module at the end, and it was blind. And they would fill a form in, it would go in an envelope, and then I would collate all the results at the end. And it didn't work because it was blind. People were being a little bit unfair to everybody, and it just didn't sit right. So we moved to a situation where every time they had a meeting, they were peer assessed. And it was almost kind of like, it was based on you have certain number of points or credits. And basically what you're going to do in the group is share those credits around on a week by week basis, or more often than that. So it became a much more subtle barometer of student engagement in terms of how they were going on. So the more times they met, and if they met regularly, they had a more kind of like consistent measure of how everybody in the group was performing. And it did work really well. They all got into it, and it wasn't hidden. This wasn't blind. This was actually almost kind of like everybody sits around the table and they get their Smarties out and they go, well, actually, Joe, you worked really well this week. I'm going to give you a couple of my Smarties because I really appreciate you got me out of a hole. So it was a very transparent process in terms of encouraging that group engagement. And we got some really positive feedback from it. It took a while to embed in and working with them. And again, this wasn't kind of like just dropped on them. We talked them through the process and we explained why we wanted to do it and the challenges of blind and how problems it had led to before. But it seemed to work. And again, I've got this. If anybody'd like a copy of the maths behind this, I can share it with you. And basically what it added to was it added a certain percentage onto their final mark. So they could get an extra 10%, and that was capped at a max. but it wasn't capped underneath. So it meant that if somebody didn't appear at a meeting when they were doing the peer assessment, actually they could get 0 on that week. So it did take into account people not engaging or coming to meetings, unless of course they'd let people know and there was an intervention around that. So again, it was the use of that within a particular group. The other thing we also built into that, which worked, was kind of like a little health barometer at the end. So as the students finished that meeting, they were all asked to collectively identify the overall health of the group. And if they were performing really well, the higher scores, that's absolutely fine, carry on. But if at any point that score of the group dropped below 7, then it was an automatic, right, you have to email me. I need to talk to you because something obviously at the moment is not quite working. This is designed as an early stage intervention. Come and have a chat. Okay. So again, all this kind of support could be available in a Google. Yes, sorry, Harold.
That last one, when you say health, are you distinguishing between sort of progress in the task and sort of group, I don't know, group community or group
it was almost, we had that discussion with it. It was almost like an amalgam of all the different everythings. If they ran into a roadblock or were having trouble with it, then that would be picked up. If there were certain members of the group that were not engaging properly, it allowed a certain person to trigger, we need to pull Andy in.
So it's both. Yep.
And the best thing I've ever done to support that was I did some coaching training years ago, and I just gave the students a little bit of coaching training in terms of how to deal with difficult people and how to get that. And at the beginning, by getting them to also develop their own, if they wanted to, develop their own criteria on which they were judging themselves, the ownership of the process. But this was just designed as a very kind of like early stage intervention that I'm here to have a chat. This is just a signal to get me in before the group breaks down completely. And we do that. The other thing I haven't put in here is, of course, what students also like to have is the eject button. If somebody is not working really well, we want to have the right to come to you and say, this person's done no work, we want them out the group. And of course, with the logbook, and they've got the records of all their meetings, if what we used to do, if there was a sustained evidence of somebody not engaging proactively in the group, and this was Chichester regs at the time, we could take them out. We gave them an alternative form assessment. They did something else, and we protected that group. And immediately it made that group feel so much more confident in terms of, we're in a safe space to engage. We've got a mechanism to take us forward that's reflecting all our levels of engagement as a group. But we have an escape mechanism. We have an eject button if somebody starts pulling our group down. And also this also allows us, for what was a group project, to bring in a form of individual assessment. They each got their own mark out of it. Now, if they'd worked really well as a group, that mark would be very similar. If in the group there were a couple of people that really shined and did lead that group, and the other people in the group probably would admit to that, then they would probably end up with a slightly higher mark overall. Again, it's just little things, but again, this was all done face to face, but the documents were just Word documents converted to PDFs that you could then put in a Google Drive and actually get them to contribute to. Okay, right there. So hopefully reflected on effective group work, challenges, hopefully kind of things that you can actually do, but also pushing you towards some strategies that would hope empower students to contribute online. Hopefully that's covered some ground. It's not designed to cover everything because it's a 1-hour session, and we can offer more support around this. But is there anything in particular anybody like to pick up, or any challenges you feel still persist, or pick up any of the examples I've shown?
Yeah, can I come in, Andy? You said that if there was a difficulty and there was an eject opportunity, and if people were taken out of groups, you said you'd give them something. I didn't quite catch. So what would happen?
Yeah, we'd come up with it was always done on a case-by-case basis, managed in terms of what the problem was. And there was always a case that the students would like the person ejected, but 9 times out of 10, we try and fix it. and to work with the group to identify what was actually going wrong. There were them, and this wasn't happening all the time, but on the occasions where it did, there was always something influencing why the person wasn't engaging. But when it was really bad, we used to take them out, and we'd have an alternative kind of like assessment. Sometimes they did an exam, or they did an individual element of some of the work that was picked up. But again, it might be slightly different. This was based around kind of like the Chichester regulations in terms of what we did. This didn't come out. This came out of a long conversation in the business school about how do we address this issue around group work. Because several years ago, we got hit, CHI Business School was hit really hard on the NSS around group work, and we were forced to take a lot of group work out. Basically, group work, no, you can't assess via group work. It's got to go. It's pulling us down. And this module that I was delivering was one of the ones I said, well, I can't do the assessment to the level I need unless it's group work. So I had to put in kind of like the intervention strategy to say, right, this is how they're going to get a group mark, because that's what the students wanted, the individual mark. And this is how I would deal with the challenge of students that weren't necessarily engaging as fully in the process as they should be.
Yeah, I think this highlights the importance of trust. So if somebody's just completely lost trust in one person, or one person has lost trust in their team, it's very hard to repair it. First of all, it takes a long time to build it. And then if you come to a stage in the middle of a semester or middle of the year where the trust has been lost, how do you ever fix it?
And to do that online is really hard.
Another level of complication.
Yeah, it's interesting. Alana's point at the beginning about socialization, and again, interpreting these kind of resources, whether you're dealing with level 4 or level 6 students. Level 4 students, I could add other things in here, but I've got them in other Padlet sessions. But for new group formation, actually making sure that there's perhaps using a Padlet where the students have to, if they've not worked together before, actually using a Padlet as a vehicle for putting up something about themselves and that collective space. But also that co-creation bent at the beginning is that, we have all these platforms for technology, but is it for us to dictate the platform? It might be. You say to the students, like, all I need you to do is create a platform or develop a mechanism where you're going to talk to each other. Now, it could be the students decide to use Facebook. It could be they decide WhatsApp. For me, it never mattered about the technology that they were using. They were using a technology that they felt comfortable with. But they led on that. They developed their own approach, so they were engaged with it from early on. So there's lots of other little tricks and tips that you can use around the outside to support that community, and that goes back to some of the early presentations that we've had in the conference last year about creating communities online, and Manesh, your stuff about orchestrate. It all starts linking in terms of there isn't one answer to developing online group work. It's about taking bits from other places and creating kind of like a holistic approach where we're beginning to get different perspectives involved. And I think there isn't necessarily a right answer. It depends on the profile of your students and actually what you're perhaps asking them to do.
Yeah. If you have many groups and each will present a slightly different twist to the problem. Very quickly it becomes out of hand. If you try and engage with every single group, it's very, very difficult.
That when it gets to bigger groups, yes, and that's become, I think sometimes the question is, well, can we manage this online? Is it with what we're trying to do still fit for purpose, or do we perhaps need to make an adjustment to it to actually make sure it's something the students want to do? I always say to staff when we're doing this, think about the nature of the stuff that you're actually asking the students to do online. Would you like to do it? Because if you're sitting there going no, then it's wrong. Sometimes, anyway, right. Anybody else? I'm just conscious of the time, and we just need to send you off to the next session in good time.
I liked some of those strategies particularly, and in a business context, most groups I've been associated with do go through that form storm type of iteration. So having mechanisms, given that you're remote, you're doubly remote because of digital, because of blended learning. I think having those sort of measures that are giving you some feedback as to, the fire is breaking out now. Yeah. And if they don't get it under control themselves, I better be ready to to tactfully step in.
Actually, I'm just thinking of something else I should perhaps put in. This goes back to, particularly at level 4, is in when you where is, and I think Stuart, please jump in, but you mentioned this earlier on about how do we induct students into the process? You just can't push them into it. In a study skills session where we talk about group work and the benefits of group work and why it's important, do we now need to make sure we need to introduce studying online as a core study skill centrally, so they've all had that understanding of transitioning into this kind of like online space. Right, colleagues, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. It's always a pleasure to see everybody. This has been recorded. It will be edited. If anybody'd like to see any of the resources which I've kind of like showed today, I'm really happy to send them round. Please just send me an email and I'll stick them in the post.